and today we're going to be talking about cells. Now, according to the cellular theory, which is basically just the scientific definition of cells, cells are the building blocks, the main unit of structure of all organisms. They're in all things and are all come from other cells, or other cells basically. Now, according to this, and this basically just means that cells are probably one of the most important things in science, or if not the most important. Now, cells, basically, in my opinion, are extremely important and are actually very, very specific and interesting. Now, there are different types of cells. There are organisms, or simple organisms, like single-celled amoeba that only have one cell to do just one thing. And there are advanced organisms, such as humans, that have specialized cells, that have more than one cell for color, to do many tasks, such as cellular respiration, which is a process in which a cell distributes energy from food particles, which is called ATP, with oxygen, and fermentation, which they do the exact same process, just without oxygen. And there are two forms of fermentation. There are lactic acid fermentation, which occur in clams, mussels, and human and animal organism muscles. And there's alcoholic fermentation, which occur in yeasts and other forms of archaea. Now, cells are also very, very simple and can also be very advanced at the same time. For example, porifera, the phyla of sponge, is just one structure that forms a very complex looking thing but only does one simple task. Now, there are two main forms of cells. There are plant cells and there are animal cells, which are both slightly different from each other. So first, let's go over the animal cell. An animal cell, and all cells, are full of things called organelles, which are basically small little components of a cell that are almost like organs inside of an organism. Now, there are many organelles inside of a cell. The outer one is called the cell membrane, or inside of an animal cell, for there's different types of organelles in some species of plant cells. There's the cell membrane, which determines what things go inside and out of the cell. There's the Golgi Apparatus, basically almost where food particles from digested food inside of stomach acid cells is deposited, where it is sent to the mitochondria, which is basically the processor of the cell's stomach, which takes the food particles and transfers it into energy, or ATP particles, which go down to different phosphorus particles and is spread throughout the cell and the body as energy. Now, there's also the endoplasmic reticulum, the cytoplasm, which is like the body of the cell. There's the outer nucleus. There are many more organelles throughout the cell. There are the ribosomes, which are almost like mini storage components around the cell. There's the vacuole, which is the main holding storage center. And most importantly, the center, the holder of DNA, and the central system of the cell, there's the nucleus. Now, not all cells have nucleus, or nuclei. There are some cells, or two subdivisions of cells, which are in the domain class of the taxonomic table, a table that organizes organisms by certain classification taxa levels, which is a Latin term. Now, the domain, which is basically a form of the taxonomic table that shows whether cells are eukaryotic or prokaryotic. This means that eukaryotes are cells that have a nucleus, which are basically animals and most organisms and plants. And then there are prokaryotes, cells that don't have a nucleus, that can function without one, which include bacteria, algae, and certain other microscopic decomposers and mushroom forms, and organisms, basically. Now, the plant cell is slightly different. For it just has more organelles in the plant cell, and some of the organelles are a bit different. 4, the plant cell has all of the same organelles that the animal cell does, except outside of the cell membrane, there's a cell wall, which is like an extra defense for the cell. And instead of having one large vacuole, it has one large vacuole and a smaller vacuole for extra storage. And though it does have a Golgi apparatus and a mitochondria, which are for nutrients that the roots suck up from the ground, the main way that a plant gets food and distributes ATP throughout the cell in the body is through its chlorophyll, which is inside of a chamber called chloroplasts. What these do is they take the sun's energy and deposit it into the Golgi apparatus, which sends to the mitochondria, which process it as energy and food particles for the cell in a process called photosynthesis. Now, the plant cell can sometimes be described as kind of more basically specific or more not generic than the animal cell, but we consider them both pretty advanced. Now, there's only one way that scientists can really gather all of this intense information on cells, and that's through a device called the microscope. Now, there are 2 types of microscopes. There's one most common and the first invented microscope called the compound microscope, in which there are 2 lenses to examine cells and microscopic organisms and things. And then there's a later, and sometimes some scientists call it a more easy way to examine cells and microscopic organisms, is the biconvex microscope, which only has 1 lens, so you can only look at it through 1 eye. Now, this is kind of a strange term if you are a known Latin fan, for bi means 2 and there's only a single lens. So how does that make sense? Well, we don't really know for sure, but we think that when companies began selling and distributing and inventing microscopes, which was normally in the Netherlands, and when they began distributing them in England, it was kind of a mistranslation of Latin to Dutch and finally to English. And somehow the name just stuck. Now, finally, what happened was, how did the microscope come to being? Well, we don't really know when, how, or who invented the microscope, but scientists predict that it was probably made sometime in the late 1500s or early 1600s. Now, we don't know exactly who invented it, but one of the most well-supported claims is by a Dutch spectacle maker and inventor named Zacharias Jansen, who posthumously claimed it through his son. However, we may never know for sure. All we do know is that when it was invented, it wasn't really used for the next 40 years because it was way too advanced for its time, and people didn't really know how to use it or what its use was. However, in the mid-1600s, a well-respected biologist and scientist named Robert Hooke from England decided to see what this microscope was, and he is the first recorded person to use it. What he did was he examined leaf petals and other certain things that composed of cells, which weren't known yet, and looked at it and saw small little components of it. He studied them, saw their shape, and saw organelles inside of them, and defined them all. He called them cells because they reminded him of almost plots and almost square, oval-like waves on a chart or on certain things, or even just prison cells. However, it's mainly used as just a regular cell. Now, what happened was once Robert Hooke started using the microscope, everyone thought, well, since this famous scientist is using it, let's make companies and entrepreneurial things out of it. And it became a very money-making system. Now, what happened was that in the 1600s, sometime after Robert Hooke's discovery, another Dutch businessman named Antony van Leeuwenhoek ended up using the microscope, who owned a microscope company and was a scientific fanatic, ended up wanting to see more things from the microscope and more about cells. he saw lots of more things. He saw more organelles, and he saw more things, and he saw algae, and he saw just almost utter scientific inquiry from this wonderful microscope. Now, one thing that he discovered, which is why he's often called the father of microbiology, where he saw bacteria for the first time off teeth scrapings and water. This kind of freaked him out, for people normally didn't really take care of their teeth very much, and the water wasn't very clean. Now, after this, though, there were some things, though, part of the cellular theory that couldn't be explained. For though the unit of structure part was explained, they couldn't determine where cells came from, or whether all objects contained cells, or only certain specialized ones. Now, in the early 1800s, two naturalists and biologists who worked separately, named Theodor Schwann and Matthias Schleiden, came up with the theories that all animals were composed of cells, and all plants were composed of cells. However, it was still unclear on whether all things, or all cells came from, or where they came from, which is why they looked towards spontaneous generation, an already proven wrong theory that stated that matter randomly appeared from other matter. Now, even though that was proven false, some people still looked at that as they had no idea where cells came from. Well, in around 1855, that question was finally answered by a biologist named Rudolf Virchow, who looked at the cells from a microscope one final time and added that part to the cellular theory as he saw cells multiplying. Now, from this, nothing has really been added to the cellular theory, but we still continue to study cells today, and it's a very interesting concept. Now, today's Latin quote is "Scientia est potentia," which means knowledge is power. And as you see as an example of the studying of the cell, you can say that knowledge truly is power. I must say,